Beneath the golden shimmer of Sunday school tales and the stained-glass majesty of ancient temples lies a narrative so ingrained, so revered, that to question it feels like pulling the thread of faith itself. Yet history, archaeology, and reason demand we pull. The story of Moses and the Exodus, the tale of a Hebrew prophet rising from the banks of the Nile, standing defiantly before Pharaoh, splitting seas and leading an entire enslaved nation to divine freedom, is perhaps the most iconic liberation myth ever told. Etched into the hearts of billions and foundational to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, it carries the weight of moral authority, divine intervention, and historical legitimacy. But beneath the thunderous proclamations and sacred scrolls, a different picture begins to emerge, one painted not by miracles, but by centuries of myth-making, political necessity, and retroactive theology. For decades, scholars, archaeologists, and theologians have dug through the sands of Egypt, sifted through the stones of Sinai, and pored over the ruins of Canaan in search of even a trace of evidence supporting the biblical account. The silence of those deserts, however, is deafening. Not a single Egyptian record speaks of a Hebrew uprising, of plagues that devastated the land, or of a pharaoh who lost his army beneath the waves. Egypt, a civilization obsessed with record-keeping, whose scribes detailed cattle births and lunar eclipses, offers not even a whisper of the 10 plagues or a mass exodus of slaves. The grand cities that the Hebrews supposedly built as slaves, Pithom and Ramesses, date from centuries after the time Moses is said to have lived. Even more damning, the Egyptian chronicles from the time of Ramses II, often associated with the Exodus narrative, describe a powerful, stable empire, unshaken, undivided, and utterly unaffected by catastrophe. There is no sudden vacuum of labor, no chaos in the Nile Delta, no pharaoh mysteriously erased from history, and the timeline fractures further. The biblical account suggests the Exodus happened around the 13th or 15th century BCE, yet the earliest evidence of a distinct Israelite culture in Canaan doesn't appear until the late 13th century BCE, and even then not as an invading force, but as an internal development from Canaanite society itself. The Israelites were not foreign liberators storming in from Egypt, but rather Canaanites themselves, evolving into a new identity over centuries. The wilderness wanderings, 40 years of divine guidance, manna from heaven, water from rocks, leave no archaeological trace across Sinai. No pottery, no campsites, no bones, no tools, no altars. For a nation of hundreds of thousands to wander the desert for 4 decades and leave nothing behind defies every known historical and archaeological principle. The numbers themselves raise red flags. Over 600 Zoroastrian men, plus women and children, would equal a migrant population of perhaps 2 to 3 million, greater than the entire population of Egypt at the time. The logistics of feeding, housing, and moving such a multitude through harsh wilderness would require infrastructure rivaling modern-day refugee operations, yet the desert speaks only in echoes. More troubling still is the silence of the Hebrews themselves in other contemporary sources. While the Bible gives detailed genealogies, laws, and rituals stemming from the Exodus experience, no external culture mentions these escaped slaves, no neighboring kingdom records the arrival of a wandering nation, no inscription tells of a people who toppled Jericho with trumpets and divine fire. The silence becomes suspicious, and the suspicion grows into revelation. The Exodus is not a historical event, but a national origin myth, one meant to inspire, unify, and validate. It is literature crafted for identity, for theology, and for political strength during times of crisis. Many scholars now argue that the Exodus narrative likely took shape during the Babylonian exile, centuries after the events supposedly occurred, when the Judeans needed a story of hope, deliverance, and divine covenant. In exile, robbed of temple, king, and land, they reached back not for historical accuracy, but for a sacred drama that would elevate their suffering into a cosmic plan. Moses, then, becomes not just a man, but a symbol of law, of liberation, of God's preference for the oppressed. But symbols are not evidence and stories are not history. The burning bush, the Red Sea, the tablets of stone, all remain absent from the world outside the pages of Scripture. And yet the story persists, not because it is true in the historical sense, but because it is true in the emotional, moral, and spiritual sense for those who believe it. Still, in the pursuit of truth, reverence must not eclipse reason. To question is not to mock, and to investigate is not to blaspheme. It is through examination, not blind faith, that we honor the intellect and conscience gifted to us. And as we pull the thread of Moses and the Exodus, what unravels is not merely a story, but the very process by which legends are born, slowly, deliberately, and with divine ambition cloaked in the language of history. As the foundational pillars of the Exodus narrative begin to tremble under the weight of absent evidence, a deeper examination reveals the extent to which the story was constructed to serve theological and political needs rather than historical accuracy. One of the most glaring inconsistencies lies in the portrayal of Egypt itself. The biblical Egypt is a land of slavery and tyranny, ruled by a hard-hearted pharaoh. Yet this depiction conflicts starkly with the historical and archaeological record of Egypt's interactions with Semitic peoples. Egyptian records, including the Amarna letters and tomb inscriptions, show that Semitic groups were present in Egypt, not as captives in brutal bondage, but often as laborers, soldiers, and even officials who integrated into society over centuries. Far from being a population in chains crying out for liberation, many Semitic peoples lived and worked alongside Egyptians with varying degrees of autonomy and status. Furthermore, the Hebrews are curiously absent from the voluminous records of the Egyptian Empire. Pharaohs immortalized their victories in massive stone inscriptions, celebrated conquests, catalogued foreign visitors, and described internal revolts in exhaustive detail. Yet the supposed cataclysmic events of the Exodus, including the death of every Egyptian firstborn, the destruction of an entire army in the Red Sea, and a slave uprising of millions, are nowhere to be found. The logistics of the story raise more doubts. The narrative claims that after the Israelites fled Egypt, they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years, a period so long that a generation died out. Yet, the Sinai Peninsula, even in antiquity, was not an uncharted wasteland. It contained trade routes, mining camps, Egyptian outposts, and Canaanite settlements. It was not an empty void, but a crossroads of civilizations. For a mass of humanity, the size of modern-day cities, to wander for 4 decades and leave no trace in such a relatively small and well-trodden region is implausible in the extreme. No skeletal remains, no tools, no dwellings, no waste pits. Nothing supports the presence of a nomadic nation living in tents for generations. The silence is not just archaeological, it is also textual. Contemporary Near Eastern records from Egypt, Canaan, Mesopotamia, and Hittite lands offer no parallel accounts of an Exodus event, no stories of a Hebrew uprising, no tales of divine plagues or mass migration. The absence of any corroborating documentation from neighboring civilizations, many of whom delighted in recording the chaos and failures of rivals, is not a minor gap, but a chasm in the historical narrative. Adding to this implausibility is the nature of the Exodus miracles themselves, which seem to reflect the worldview and literary tropes of the authors more than eyewitness testimony. The 10 plagues, while dramatic, follow a stylized and escalating pattern common in ancient mythologies, each more theatrical than the last. The Nile turning to blood, frogs swarming the land, darkness covering the sky. These are not the measured accounts of chroniclers, but the moral dramatizations of storytellers. Similarly, the parting of the Red Sea echoes Mesopotamian chaos versus order myths, where seas are split and chaos is tamed by divine power. The Exodus story fits comfortably into the genre of ancient epic literature, where divine intervention, symbolic numbers, and miraculous signs affirm the identity and mission of the chosen people. Yet if this story was crafted rather than chronicled, when was it written and by whom? The leading academic consensus suggests that the Exodus narrative took its final shape during or shortly after the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BCE, a period of immense crisis for the people of Judah. Their temple was destroyed, their king dethroned, and their elite population carried off to a foreign land. In this context, a narrative of divine deliverance became a lifeline, a source of hope and identity. Moses, once a distant ancestral figure, was transformed into a liberator prophet, the giver of law and covenant, a symbol of divine favor in the face of oppression. The Exodus, then, became a national charter, a sacred myth that explained not only where the people had come from, but why their suffering had meaning. It was a theologically motivated retelling, not a remembered past, and the layers of that retelling show their seams when examined closely. The geographical descriptions in the Exodus text are inconsistent and anachronistic. The place names often reflect later periods rather than the supposed time of Moses. Some of the route descriptions make little sense geographically and seem to reflect a symbolic or liturgical journey rather than a real migration. Moreover, the moral structure of the narrative, where Egypt is the oppressor and Israel the victim, mirrors the post-exilic dichotomy between Babylon and the remnant of Judah, casting the theological drama of current events backward into a fictionalized past. This retrospective construction is not unusual in ancient literature, where the past is molded to give meaning to the present, but when taken as literal history, it becomes problematic. The Exodus narrative, when viewed through the lens of modern scholarship, begins to resemble a national epic, a story told not because it happened, but because it needed to happen in the imagination of a people searching for purpose. And while the story may carry deep moral and spiritual resonance, its historical foundation crumbles under scrutiny. The absence of evidence, the inconsistencies in the narrative, the mythic structure of the miracles, and the geopolitical context of its composition all point toward fabrication rather than documentation. Yet even as this truth emerges, the story of Moses and the Exodus remains central to millions, protected not by facts, but by faith, by tradition, and by the enduring power of narrative. It is a testament to the human need for meaning, for heroes, for divine justice in the face of suffering. But if we are to honor history, we must also acknowledge myth and recognize that sometimes the greatest stories ever told are those that never happened. The deeper one descends into the origins of the Exodus narrative, the more apparent it becomes that the tale was sculpted over centuries of retelling, redaction, and religious evolution, a palimpsest of theological agendas and nationalistic myth-making layered upon the earliest whispers of tribal memory. One of the most revealing facets of this literary evolution is the composite nature of the Pentateuch, particularly the books of Exodus and Numbers. Modern biblical scholarship, through the documentary hypothesis, identifies multiple sources, namely the Yahwist, Elohist, priestly, and Deuteronomist strands, each contributing overlapping and at times contradictory versions of the same events. In the story of Moses and the plagues, for instance, we often see duplications of events with different details and emphases, suggesting that multiple authors were merging regional traditions into a unified narrative. These traditions were not historical records, but theological reflections, shaped by the political needs of different eras, especially the post-exilic period when the identity of the Jewish people was fragile, fragmented, and in urgent need of a cohesive founding story. Even the figure of Moses himself appears more mythic than historical. With parallels to other legendary lawgivers and saviors from surrounding cultures, Moses bears resemblance to Sargon of Akkad, who was also set adrift in a basket as a child and rose to greatness. His dual identity as both Hebrew and Egyptian serves as an allegory of liminality and divine purpose, rather than a biographical truth. The mountain encounter with God, the 10 Commandments written by divine hand, the glowing face veiled from the people, all reflect literary motifs of ancient hero epics and divine favor rather than historical reportage. Furthermore, the laws attributed to Moses in Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy appear to be drawn from earlier legal traditions, such as the Code of Hammurabi, raising questions about their origin. These laws were codified and ritualized to unify a diverse population under a singular divine authority, using the figure of Moses as the ultimate mediator. They were not dictated to a man on a mountain in thunder and smoke, but compiled by priestly scribes over centuries to establish religious order and social cohesion. And what of the conquest of Canaan, the grand finale of the Exodus journey, where the Israelites, under Joshua's command, purportedly sweep through the Promised Land in a divine campaign of annihilation and settlement. Archaeological evidence once again contradicts the biblical account. Jericho, the city whose walls famously fell to trumpet blasts, was already in ruins by the time the Israelites were said to have arrived. Other cities mentioned in the conquest narrative, such as Ai and Hazor, show no evidence of destruction or occupation at the alleged time. The pattern that emerges is not one of sudden invasion, but of gradual infiltration and cultural assimilation. The early Israelites, far from being foreign conquerors, appear to have been indigenous Canaanites who broke away from existing city-states and developed a new, distinct identity in the highlands of central Palestine. This process of ethnogenesis is slow, organic, and undocumented in sweeping military triumphs. Instead of divine mandate and miraculous conquest, the birth of Israel resembles the birth of other ancient nations, rooted in economic shifts, tribal alliances, and evolving religious practices. The worship of Yahweh, which later becomes central to Israelite identity, initially appears alongside other deities in inscriptions and shrines. Early Israelites were not monotheists in the modern sense, but likely practiced a form of henotheism, elevating Yahweh without denying the existence of other gods. The Exodus story, with its dramatic revelation of a singular jealous God, served as a theological turning point, a way to centralize and purify a diverse pantheon into a singular divine authority. The Passover ritual, commemorating the night when death passed over the Hebrew homes, reflects older springtime agricultural festivals repurposed to fit the liberation myth. What we begin to see is a grand tapestry of spiritual evolution, rituals, laws, and stories coalescing over generations into a narrative that spoke powerfully to a people seeking purpose, especially in exile. The Babylonian conquest, which shattered Jerusalem and deported its elite, created the existential crisis that demanded a new national mythology. In that crucible of despair, the editors of the Hebrew Bible crafted a past that offered hope, dignity, and divine selection. The Exodus was no longer just a tale. It was a theological declaration of identity. We are a people delivered by God. We are chosen. We have suffered and survived, and our history has meaning. Yet this profound purpose does not equate to historical fact. The elevation of a spiritually compelling myth into unquestionable truth created a chasm between faith and evidence. Over the centuries, attempts to reconcile the biblical narrative with archaeology have produced increasingly strained theories: that the Exodus was a much smaller event, that it was symbolic, that it occurred in a different time under a different name, or that evidence simply hasn't survived. But each attempt falls apart under scrutiny. The deserts of Sinai remain mute. The cities of Canaan do not bear the scars of conquest. Egypt does not lament its losses. The journey from oppression to freedom, central to Jewish identity and echoed in Christian and Islamic traditions, stands on foundations of faith, not stone. Still, the myth endures because it fulfills a deeper need. In the Exodus, the oppressed find triumph, the lost find direction, and the faithful find a God who intervenes. It is a myth that has inspired revolutions, underpinned liberation theology, and provided comfort in exile. It is a story of justice against tyranny, of divine purpose over chaos. But it is a story, not a chronicle. And as with all powerful stories, its endurance is not a testament to its historicity, but to its resonance. The real Moses may never have existed, the Red Sea may never have parted, and Egypt may never have trembled. But the power of the Exodus lives on in every heart that yearns for freedom and in every community that dares to believe that history bends toward deliverance. As the mythos of Moses and the Exodus weaves itself deeper into the sacred texts and moral consciousness of Western civilization, the consequences of accepting legend as literal history begin to surface in both subtle and seismic ways, shaping not only religious identity, but geopolitical conviction, cultural memory, and even national policy. For thousands of years, the Exodus story has not merely functioned as a tale of deliverance, but as a divine precedent, legitimizing the possession of land, the inheritance of law, and the right of chosen people to act under divine directive. This theological narrative has been invoked to justify wars, colonization, and conquest, from the earliest days of Israelite settlement to modern political rhetoric echoing biblical entitlement. The spiritual power of the Exodus is undeniable, but when myth is taken as historical charter, the lines between faith and factual reality blur into dangerous absolutes. The modern state of Israel, for example, draws deeply on biblical narratives to assert historical claims to land and ancestry, yet the archaeological record paints a far more complex and troubling picture. Rather than descending from a band of foreign slaves liberated by divine will, the earliest Israelites appear to have emerged from within Canaanite society itself. Inscriptions from the 13th century BCE refer to a people called Israel living in the highlands of Canaan, but they show no signs of being newcomers or invaders. The Merneptah Stele, often cited as the earliest mention of Israel outside the Bible, does not depict them as a conquering force, but simply as a tribal entity among others. This directly contradicts the narrative of divine conquest following the Exodus, and it suggests that the story was constructed not to reflect history, but to inspire a dislocated people with a sense of divine destiny. The gap between biblical tradition and historical evidence widens further when we examine the supposed route of the Exodus. According to the Bible, the Israelites crossed the Red Sea, more accurately translated as the Sea of Reeds, and entered the Sinai Peninsula, where they wandered for 40 years. Yet the identification of the actual crossing point remains speculative, with various theories placing it at different shallow lakes or marshes along the eastern Nile Delta. No archaeological evidence supports a mass crossing of any kind, and the geography of the biblical account often contradicts itself. Mount Sinai, where Moses received the Ten Commandments, has multiple proposed locations, each with its own set of problems. Traditional sites lack evidence of occupation during the relevant periods, and some scholars suggest that Sinai was not a real mountain at all, but a literary device symbolizing divine encounter and covenant. The ambiguity of these locations is not due to the passage of time alone, but to the fact that the story was never rooted in geography. It was rooted in liturgy, in theology, in ritual. The very structure of the Exodus narrative suggests it was composed for public reading and religious performance, with dramatic repetition, symbolic numbers, and carefully orchestrated divine-human interactions. The number 40, for example, appears throughout the Bible as a symbol of purification, testing, and transition, not as a literal time span. 40 years in the wilderness, like 40 days of rain in the flood, or 40 days of fasting in the desert, represents spiritual transformation rather than chronological precision. In this light, the Exodus becomes a spiritual odyssey, a mythic journey from bondage to freedom that transcends historical accuracy and enters the realm of sacred allegory. Yet the insistence on literalism has had consequences, especially when used to define identity and justify power. The belief that a people were chosen, delivered, and promised a specific territory by divine mandate can lead to exclusion, entitlement, and conflict. This myth, when wielded without nuance, becomes a tool of domination rather than liberation. It is no coincidence that enslaved populations throughout history have also turned to the Exodus as a symbol of hope. Enslaved Africans in the Americas, oppressed Christians under Roman rule, and persecuted Jews under countless regimes have all found strength in the vision of a God who rescues the downtrodden and leads them to freedom. But the story's power lies in its metaphor, not in its accuracy. When metaphor is mistaken for memory and legend for lineage, the resulting dogma distorts the past and binds the future. Even within Jewish tradition, the evolution of the Exodus story reflects changing needs and theological insights. Early versions emphasized deliverance and covenant, while later rabbinic interpretations explored ethical dimensions, personal liberation, and moral responsibility. The Passover Seder, which ritualizes the Exodus every year, is not a history lesson but a reenactment of spiritual awakening. The Haggadah commands each participant to see themselves as if they personally had come out of Egypt, not to believe the historical event literally, but to internalize its message. This is the power of myth at its best: transformative, unifying, morally instructive. But when belief in literal events becomes the foundation for legal, political, or scientific claims, myth becomes a shackle rather than a key. The rise of biblical literalism in modern times, particularly in certain evangelical and fundamentalist circles, has reignited the debate over the historicity of the Exodus. Museums have built exhibits showcasing speculative Exodus routes. Pseudo-scientific expeditions search for chariot wheels at the bottom of the sea. Entire curricula reject evolutionary science in favor of a timeline derived from biblical genealogies. And in all of this, the boundary between faith and falsification becomes perilously thin. The tragedy is not that people believe in something greater than themselves, that is the essence of spirituality, but that so much effort is spent defending the impossible while ignoring the profound truths the story actually contains. The real meaning of the Exodus lies not in its historicity, but in its call to justice, liberation, and faith in the possibility of renewal. To insist that the story must be literally true to be spiritually valid is to miss the point entirely. It is not the absence of archaeological evidence that diminishes the Exodus, but the refusal to embrace its mythic nature that confines it. Let the deserts remain silent, the stones uncarved, the tombs unshaken, for the truth of the Exodus lies not beneath the sands, but within the conscience of every generation that hears its echo and chooses to believe not in the facts of the past, but in the hope of the future. Beneath the enduring weight of tradition and theological reverence, one begins to perceive how the narrative architecture of the Exodus is less a window into ancient events and more a mirror reflecting the needs, fears, and aspirations of the communities that preserved and expanded it across centuries. The Exodus is a living story, shaped not by eyewitnesses but by scribes, prophets, exiles, and poets, each layering upon it the anxieties of their age, the hopes for deliverance, and the divine justification for survival amid oppression. Its continued centrality in Judeo-Christian consciousness is not rooted in archaeological discovery, but in emotional and cultural resonance, in the story's ability to give voice to suffering and to promise that history, no matter how brutal, is not without meaning. Yet this resonance does not exonerate it from scrutiny. The monumental claim that an entire nation was delivered from slavery by divine force demands the same historical rigor as any other claim of ancient mass migration, especially when this story forms the backbone of modern ideological and territorial assertions. The more carefully scholars trace the development of the Exodus narrative, the more visible the editorial fingerprints become. Early fragments found within the Hebrew Bible suggest more localized traditions of escape from Egypt or deliverance from enemies, later woven together into a cohesive national epic. The earliest known mentions of Yahweh, found in Egyptian inscriptions from the land of the Shasu people in the region of Edom and Midian, suggest that the worship of this deity did not originate among the Hebrews in Egypt, but from nomadic tribes in the southern Levant. This points to a profound shift. Rather than Yahweh being revealed on Mount Sinai to a liberated people, it is likely that the worship of Yahweh emerged gradually among semi-nomadic groups who eventually identified themselves as Israelites. The mountain of God, the law-giving, the covenant rituals, these elements reflect not a historical encounter, but a literary creation used to bind disparate tribes under a single religious identity. This process of narrative construction reached its peak during the 7th century BCE, under the reign of King Josiah in Judah, who initiated sweeping religious reforms. The Deuteronomistic historians who wrote during this period crafted a story that centralized Jerusalem, elevated the Mosaic law, and emphasized a singular covenantal relationship between God and Israel. The Exodus story, under their pen, became both a theological weapon and a moral compass, justifying religious purity, political unification, and national destiny. It was no longer merely a tale of escape. It was the divine blueprint for societal order, for ritual observance, and for obedience to Yahweh alone. In this context, Moses transforms into more than a prophet. He becomes the founding father of monotheism, the conduit of divine law and the archetype of leadership. And yet no contemporary records from Egypt, Canaan, or surrounding nations corroborate his existence. His deeds, so foundational to three world religions, exist only in the literary realm, passed from scroll to scroll, sermon to sermon, heart to heart. The figure of Moses, like so many legendary lawgivers, carries the weight of collective yearning rather than historical reality. He represents the ideal leader, wise, just, reluctant, obedient to divine will yet deeply human in his moments of doubt and rage. But his absence from the historical record is not a mere oversight. It is an indication that his role is symbolic rather than biographical. The Torah, as a literary and theological masterpiece, does not seek to chronicle history, but to encode meaning, to instill identity, and to define what it means to be a people chosen not by might but by memory. And memory, unlike history, does not require evidence, it requires belief. This distinction becomes critical when the Exodus is invoked in political or educational contexts as factual history. When myth is elevated to historical doctrine, the result is not spiritual enrichment, but intellectual erosion. Children are taught a version of history that has been refuted by every discipline from archaeology to Egyptology. Generations are raised with a binary worldview in which divine intervention supersedes rational inquiry, and where skepticism is branded as heresy. But the truth does not fear investigation. In fact, true faith should thrive in the light of reason, not cower behind the shadows of unverifiable tradition. The silence of the Sinai is not a threat to belief, it is a call to understand the purpose of story. The power of the Exodus lies not in what it records, but in what it conveys: the longing for liberation, the sanctity of law, the demand for justice, and the faith in a moral universe. When stripped of its historical pretense, the story reveals its true brilliance, not as a document of ancient events, but as a narrative framework through which oppressed peoples have found voice and purpose for millennia. From African slaves in America singing of Pharaoh and deliverance, to Jewish families recounting the Haggadah under the shadow of the Holocaust, to modern activists quoting Moses before marching for freedom, the myth endures because it is adaptable, portable, and emotionally true even when historically false. That is the paradox and the danger. It is a lie that tells deeper truths, but when mistaken for truth itself, it distorts both past and present. For history must remain distinct from myth, not because myth is unworthy, but because history demands a different kind of integrity, an integrity rooted in evidence, in honesty, and in the courage to face what truly was, rather than what we wish had been. The greatness of the Exodus story is not diminished by its unhistoricity. Rather, it is elevated when we see it for what it is: a sacred mirror reflecting the eternal human struggle for meaning, identity, and deliverance in a world often silent to our suffering. But we must be vigilant not to confuse that mirror with a window, lest we see what was never there and miss the truth standing before us in the stillness of the sand. With every deeper excavation into the sands of ancient Egypt, the hills of Sinai, and the ruins of Canaan, the weight of the evidence, or more precisely, the conspicuous absence of it, draws an unmistakable conclusion. The Exodus, as described in the Bible, is not a historical event, but a constructed narrative. It is a foundational myth, one designed to imbue a scattered and threatened people with unity, identity, and divine purpose. And yet, despite the overwhelming silence of archaeology, the story persists as one of the most deeply cherished and unshakable convictions within the Abrahamic religions. Why? Because the Exodus is not merely a historical claim, it is an emotional anchor. It is the declaration that God takes sides with the oppressed, that suffering has meaning, and that deliverance is both possible and promised. But therein lies the double-edged nature of sacred myth. When used metaphorically, it inspires. When interpreted literally, it misleads. One of the most persistent illusions clung to by literalists is that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, and while this is true in narrow scientific terms, it collapses under the burden of scale when applied to the Exodus. A migration of 2 to 3 million people would have left massive environmental, demographic, and archaeological footprints. Campsites, waste, burials, pottery fragments, altars, tools — such signs are absent across every site associated with the supposed journey from Goshen to Canaan. Moreover, the logistics of sustaining such a population in the wilderness for 40 years is implausible even by modern standards. The amount of food, water, clothing, livestock, and sanitation required to support millions in a desert would rival the infrastructure of a modern city. Yet no Egyptian records note a sudden loss of such a vast labor force. No Canaanite cities bear the scars of divine conquest by an incoming nation. The narrative claims collapse under the simplest scrutiny, not because of atheistic skepticism, but because of the plain facts that history demands. And yet the myth survived not because it was true, but because it was necessary. During the Babylonian exile and the centuries following it, the Judeans were in a state of existential threat. Their temple was gone, their monarchy ended, their land occupied. They needed a unifying identity, and they found it not in genealogy or territory, but in narrative. The Exodus was retroactively shaped to offer that unshakable myth of chosenness, the plagues that humbled an empire, the sea that split for the faithful, the voice of God etched into stone. All of it created a powerful memory of identity forged in suffering and sanctified by divine will. The effect was revolutionary. It gave birth to Judaism, as a faith not centered on temple but on covenant, not on king but on law. This story traveled across time and culture, adopted by Christianity and later echoed in Islam, each tradition reinterpreting its symbols and meanings. Christianity transformed the Exodus into a prophecy of spiritual liberation through Christ. Islam retained the story of Moses as a prophet, but recontextualized it within the Quranic framework. Each iteration carried forward the myth's emotional weight, but with every step, the historical tether grew thinner. Attempts in modern times to salvage the Exodus narrative often take the form of minimalism, suggesting that while the full story is exaggerated, there may have been a small group of Semitic slaves who escaped Egypt and whose tale was gradually mythologized. But this hypothesis, while well-intentioned, is built not on evidence, but on the reluctance to let go of a beloved story. There is no trace of such a group in Egyptian slave records, which are otherwise meticulous. No linguistic or cultural markers in early Israelite settlements indicate an Egyptian origin. The names, laws, and social customs of the early Israelites align far more closely with their Canaanite neighbors than with Egyptian norms. What's more, early Israelite religious practices, such as the worship of El, Baal, and Asherah alongside Yahweh, suggest a syncretic evolution rather than a sudden revolution brought by a divinely liberated people. The truth is far more complex and far more human. The Israelites did not emerge from outside Canaan, but from within it. They were a rural underclass who over centuries distinguished themselves from the urban Canaanite city-states and developed a unique religious and social identity. The Exodus story, then, is not the record of a divine intervention, but a retroactive projection of hope and meaning onto a gradual cultural birth. And yet the danger of the Exodus narrative lies not in its mythical content, but in the unwillingness to acknowledge its mythic nature. When modern states or religious leaders invoke the Exodus to justify land claims, military actions, or divine favoritism, the result is not inspiration, but dogma. Myths can uplift, but when mistaken for historical entitlement, they can fuel conflict, exclusion, and oppression. The modern Middle East, for instance, remains haunted by the echoes of biblical promises interpreted literally. The claim that a piece of land is divinely mandated to one group because of an event that likely never happened is not only historically untenable, it is morally perilous. For history is not a weapon, and theology is not a deed of ownership. To move forward, a reckoning is required, not with faith itself, but with the way faith has been taught, wielded, and defended. The Exodus must be approached not as a forensic puzzle to be solved, but as a sacred myth to be understood. Its value lies not in proving whether the Red Sea parted, but in grappling with the deep truths it tries to convey, that oppression is real, that deliverance is worth striving for, that the arc of the moral universe may bend toward justice, but only when people walk the difficult path through the wilderness of conscience and doubt. The story of Moses and the Exodus, when liberated from the chains of literalism, can once again breathe. It can inspire without deceiving. It can guide without misleading. It can be what it was always meant to be, not a history book written in stone, but a living narrative etched into the hearts of those who long for meaning in the midst of chaos. But that freedom begins with the courage to let go, not of faith, but of illusion. Once the veil of historical certainty is pulled back, the Exodus narrative reveals itself not as a singular immutable truth, but as a rich tapestry of evolving stories, shaped, stretched, and reconfigured by generations seeking divine legitimacy for their present struggles. This becomes even more evident when we examine how the Exodus functions within the broader literary and theological architecture of the Hebrew Bible. It is not an isolated account, but the central axis around which the entire identity of Israel is constructed. From the laws of Leviticus to the lamentations of the prophets, the Exodus is invoked repeatedly as the foundational moment when a group of slaves became a holy nation, when a covenant was forged in the fire of divine judgment, and when a wandering people were given purpose. But this centrality also makes it vulnerable. If the Exodus falls, if it is shown not to be historical but constructed, what then becomes of the identity built upon it? That is the quiet terror that haunts literalist defenders of the story, not just the loss of a cherished tale, but the unraveling of an entire framework of divine favor and moral authority. Yet clinging to a narrative simply because it is comforting is the very antithesis of truth-seeking. The modern study of the ancient Near East provides no evidence of an Israelite presence in Egypt at the scale or time described in the Bible. The Egyptian Empire, during the Late Bronze Age, was a formidable and well-documented power, yet its annals, detailing everything from taxation records to enemy incursions, are silent on the sudden disappearance of hundreds of thousands of slaves. Even the Hebrew language, when traced linguistically, shows no significant Egyptian influence that would be expected from centuries of immersion in Egyptian society. Cultural borrowings are minor and likely the result of trade and regional interaction, not long-term enslavement. Moreover, the book of Exodus itself contains clues that betray its later composition. The mention of cities such as Pithom and Ramses links the narrative to the reign of Ramesses II in the 13th century BCE, yet the broader structure of the story includes references, customs, and geographical details that suggest an even later authorship, likely post-exilic. The layering of sources, Yahwist, Elohist, priestly, and Deuteronomist, further complicates the notion of a single, coherent tradition passed down through oral history. What we have instead is a complex mosaic of traditions, each reflecting the theological concerns of its time, compiled and edited by scribes who saw in Moses and the Exodus a vehicle for communicating God's justice, wrath, mercy, and covenant. These editors were not frauds. They were theologians, artists, and nation-builders. They understood the power of narrative to forge identity, especially in the face of exile, conquest, and cultural annihilation. In their hands, the Exodus became more than a liberation tale. It became the ultimate divine drama, a clash between empire and God, oppression and promise, chaos and law. But this divine drama was never meant to be a transcript of historical events. The splitting of the sea, the raining of bread from heaven, the pillar of fire and cloud, these are symbols, not logistics. They speak to the human condition, not the historical record, and the insistence on their literal reality diminishes their symbolic power. When miracles become demands for historical validation, they are reduced to tricks of divine showmanship rather than profound expressions of hope. Even within ancient Judaism, the Exodus was never understood in purely literal terms. The rabbis of the Talmudic era, living centuries after the biblical text had been canonized, frequently interpreted Exodus passages allegorically, morally, or symbolically. They saw Egypt not merely as a place, but as a state of spiritual bondage. They understood Pharaoh not just as a king, but as a metaphor for ego, oppression, and idolatry. This rich interpretive tradition allowed the story to adapt and endure, to be reimagined in times of persecution and reborn in movements for justice. And yet, this interpretive fluidity has been increasingly replaced in modern times by a rigid literalism, especially in communities that see the Bible not as a sacred conversation across generations, but as a single inerrant document dictated by the divine. This modern fundamentalism, born largely from 19th and 20th century reactions to scientific and historical criticism, has done more to damage the credibility of religious tradition than any archaeological discovery. By insisting that every word of the Exodus is historically accurate, it sets believers up for disillusionment when evidence fails to appear. It turns a powerful myth into a brittle dogma and creates a false dichotomy. Either the Exodus happened exactly as written, or faith is a lie. But this is a false choice. One can reject the historical reality of the Exodus and still find in its story a deep well of meaning. One can recognize Moses as a literary construct and still hear in his voice the cry for justice. One can admit the absence of chariots beneath the Red Sea and still feel the weight of the journey from bondage to freedom that every generation must undertake in its own way. What is needed is not the defense of myth as fact, but the courage to reframe the question. Not did it happen, but why was it told? Not where is the evidence, but what does this story reveal about those who told it and about us who still read it? In this reframing lies the possibility of reclaiming the Exodus, not as a failed historical hypothesis, but as a living narrative, one that can still guide, inspire, and challenge without demanding belief in the unbelievable. For in the end, the greatest power of the Exodus is not in what it says about ancient Egypt or Moses or Pharaoh, but in what it says about liberation, memory, and the enduring human hunger for a story that makes sense of suffering and gives shape to hope. The consequences of revealing the Exodus as a foundational myth rather than a historical event ripple far beyond academic debate. They touch on the very essence of identity, faith, and moral consciousness that have been built upon its narrative for millennia. By portraying the Israelites as divinely chosen and liberated from Egyptian bondage, the Bible offers not only spiritual guidance, but also a blueprint for social cohesion, law, and national purpose. However, when the story is scrutinized against the hard lens of archaeology and historiography, its inconsistencies and contradictions emerge with remarkable clarity. The most prominent of these lies in the portrayal of Egypt as a land of enslavement and tyranny, which conflicts with records indicating that Semitic peoples often lived within Egyptian society as laborers, administrators, and even military personnel. Far from being subjugated in vast numbers, these groups were integrated into the social and economic framework of the state, enjoying varying degrees of autonomy and influence. The biblical narrative exaggerates oppression to a degree that strains credulity, especially when considering the logistical impossibility of the large-scale exodus it describes. Moving hundreds of thousands of people, along with livestock and belongings, through harsh desert terrain for decades would have left an indelible mark on both the landscape and the historical record. Yet, the Sinai Peninsula remains silent. Archaeological surveys have uncovered no evidence of such encampments, no artifacts of sustained habitation, no cemeteries or waste sites that might attest to prolonged nomadic activity. This silence extends to the conquest of Canaan, where cities such as Jericho, Ai, and Hazor are central to the biblical account, but show either no evidence of destruction or occupation at the time of the supposed Israelite invasion. Rather than foreign conquerors entering the land with divine endorsement, the early Israelites appear to have been indigenous Canaanites, gradually forming a distinct cultural and religious identity in the highlands, a process confirmed by settlement patterns, pottery styles, and anthropological analysis. Compounding these historical and archaeological concerns are textual anomalies within the biblical manuscripts themselves. The multiplicity of sources, repeated narratives, differing chronologies, and conflicting theological emphases suggest that the Exodus story was compiled over centuries rather than recorded contemporaneously. The Yahwist, Elohist, priestly, and Deuteronomist strands, each contributing unique elements, were edited together to produce a seamless story that served post-exilic concerns, establishing centralized worship, codifying law, and legitimizing a national covenant. In essence, the story was constructed not to document history, but to solidify identity, instill obedience, and affirm divine providence. The miracles themselves, plagues of Egypt, the parting of the sea, manna from heaven, serve symbolic functions. They dramatize the struggle between oppression and liberation, chaos and order, human frailty and divine authority. Their literary elegance and narrative cohesion reinforce the moral and theological points the editors sought to convey. But their historicity is unsupported. They exist in the realm of allegory, not evidence. Understanding the Exodus as a myth does not diminish its power. In fact, it may enhance it by allowing believers and scholars alike to engage with the story on its intended level. Its enduring relevance is in its themes of liberation, justice, and covenantal relationship, lessons that transcend the need for literal verification. Moreover, the Exodus myth has served as a moral touchstone across cultures, inspiring movements for freedom and resistance against oppression, from the spirituals of enslaved Africans in the Americas to the liberation theology of modern activists. It has offered hope where history was grim, providing a narrative framework through which suffering could be understood and agency reclaimed. Yet the insistence on its literal accuracy in modern discourse risks conflating myth with historical fact, with potentially dangerous consequences. When sacred stories are wielded as evidence of divine approval for political or territorial claims, the result can be exclusion, entitlement, and conflict. And recognizing the Exodus as a constructed narrative allows its ethical and spiritual dimensions to shine without being burdened by historical impossibilities. It permits the story to function as a guide for moral imagination, empathy, and courage in the face of injustice. In approaching the Exodus this way, one is invited to see Moses not as a historical figure whose existence must be proved, but as an archetype embodying leadership, moral clarity, and the capacity to inspire collective action under duress. Pharaoh becomes more than a literal tyrant. He represents systemic oppression, human hubris, and the obstacles that any people or individual faces in pursuit of freedom. The journey from slavery to liberation, through wilderness trials and divine instruction, mirrors the spiritual and ethical journeys undertaken by humanity across time. By embracing this symbolic understanding, the Exodus transcends the limitations of archaeology and history, becoming a timeless narrative that speaks to the human condition. Its enduring influence is not rooted in the sands of Sinai or the banks of the Nile, but in the hearts of those who draw courage and moral guidance from its story. In this sense, the Exodus is greater than history. It is myth in its most powerful and enduring form, offering meaning, resilience, and ethical instruction for each generation that engages with it thoughtfully and critically. Yet the challenge remains, to honor the narrative without demanding its literal truth, to revere its lessons without mistaking them for historical record, and to allow the myth to illuminate the path toward justice, freedom, and moral integrity, while never confusing the radiance of its symbolism with the cold certainties of fact. Examining the Exodus through a critical lens reveals not merely the absence of historical corroboration, but also the sophisticated literary, theological, and cultural mechanisms that allowed the narrative to endure and shape civilizations for millennia. The story of Moses leading the Israelites from Egypt, the 10 plagues, the crossing of the Red Sea, the giving of the 10 Commandments, and the 40 years of wandering in the wilderness is not an isolated chronicle. It is the foundation upon which the identity, law, and spiritual consciousness of the Israelites, and later of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, was constructed. Yet every element of this story, when compared to archaeological evidence, contemporary records, and the principles of historical plausibility, unravels into layers of myth-making rather than empirical truth. For example, the scale of the Exodus as described in the Torah is staggering. Hundreds of thousands of men, plus women and children, totaling potentially 2 to 3 million people, leaving the Nile Delta in a single, cohesive migration. The logistics of such a movement through desert terrain for decades, accompanied by livestock and supplies, defy the capacities of an ancient society without leaving traces. Archaeologists have scoured Sinai and surrounding regions for evidence of sustained habitation, campsites, pottery, tools, or burial sites, but find none. Likewise, Egypt, a civilization obsessed with record-keeping and monumental inscriptions, documents revolts, plagues, and natural disasters with painstaking detail, yet offers no corroboration for the 10 plagues, the sudden loss of labor, or the death of an entire army in the Red Sea. These absences suggest that the Exodus is not a historical account, but a crafted narrative designed to serve a specific theological and cultural purpose. The composition of the Torah itself supports this conclusion. Scholars identify multiple sources, Yahwist, Elohist, priestly, and Deuteronomist, whose narratives were edited together over centuries, resulting in inconsistencies, duplications, and anachronisms. Cities mentioned in the conquest narratives often did not exist at the purported time, while geographical references reflect knowledge of later periods rather than contemporary Egypt or Canaan. Numbers, dates, and timelines are symbolic, not literal, with the number 40 recurring throughout Scripture as a motif of trial, transformation, and covenantal testing. Moses himself is best understood not as a historical figure but as a literary archetype, the reluctant prophet, the mediator between God and people, and the embodiment of leadership under divine guidance. His life, as presented in Scripture, mirrors mythic patterns found in neighboring cultures, from Sargon of Akkad's infancy in a basket to other ancient hero narratives. His deeds, the plagues, the sea crossing, the law-giving, function as theological allegory, demonstrating divine justice, human obedience, and the moral imperative of liberation. Archaeological evidence from Canaan further undermines the historicity of the conquest narratives. Excavations reveal that Jericho, Ai, Hazor, and other cities central to biblical accounts do not display destruction layers consistent with an Israelite invasion. Instead, settlement patterns suggest a gradual emergence of Israelite identity from within the indigenous Canaanite population. The Israelites were likely semi-nomadic highland groups who coalesced into a distinct culture over centuries, adopting Yahweh as a central deity while retaining elements of older Canaanite religious practices. The Exodus, therefore, is better understood as a retroactive myth composed during the Babylonian exile to provide a displaced and demoralized population with a narrative of hope, purpose, and divine election. The story offers moral and spiritual truths that transcend historical fact, that oppression exists, that liberation is possible, that a community bound by law and covenant can endure, and that divine justice can ultimately prevail. The narrative's continued influence demonstrates its psychological and cultural power. Throughout history, it has inspired enslaved populations, persecuted minorities, and reformers who found in Moses' journey a template for resistance and hope. African American spirituals, liberation theology, and movements for civil rights echo the Exodus story, underscoring its enduring metaphorical potency. Yet the insistence on literal historical accuracy, particularly in modern religious and educational contexts, risks distorting both faith and understanding. When myth is mistaken for history, it can be wielded to justify political or territorial claims, encourage exclusionary ideologies, or suppress critical inquiry. Recognizing the Exodus as a sacred narrative rather than a literal historical record allows its ethical and spiritual lessons to flourish without being undermined by empirical scrutiny. In this light, the Exodus emerges as a masterwork of religious imagination, a story whose power lies not in its factual accuracy, but in its ability to articulate the human longing for freedom, the necessity of moral law, and the possibility of divine providence amidst suffering. Its miracles are not historical events but symbols of transformation. Its laws are not ancient codifications but moral frameworks. Its journey is not a migration across deserts, but a journey of conscience, identity, and collective purpose. Understanding this distinction preserves the integrity of both faith and reason, allowing the story of Moses and the Exodus to retain its profound resonance while acknowledging the reality revealed by archaeology, historiography, and critical scholarship. The Exodus, in this sense, is both a story and a tool, a narrative capable of inspiring action, guiding ethical reflection, and sustaining hope, even as its historical underpinnings dissolve under the light of evidence. It remains a testament to the human capacity to create meaning, to envision liberation, and to bind a people together through shared myth, demonstrating that the truth of a story is not always measured by its empirical reality, but by its enduring moral and spiritual influence. As we arrive at the final contemplation of Moses and the Exodus, the narrative's enduring grip on human consciousness becomes clearer than ever, revealing a tension between myth and history that continues to shape religious thought, moral understanding, and cultural identity. The story, though lacking corroboration in the archaeological record and contradicted by the practical realities of ancient Egypt and Canaan, has been enshrined as foundational because it speaks to universal human experiences: oppression and hope, bondage and deliverance, law and morality, divine presence and human responsibility. When critically examined, the Exodus is a literary and theological construct designed to unify a people, instill moral discipline, and provide a sense of identity amidst dislocation, exile, and societal upheaval. Its miraculous elements, the plagues, the parting of the sea, the manna from heaven, and the divine revelations on Mount Sinai, function symbolically, illustrating the struggle for liberation and the covenantal bond between humanity and the divine, rather than chronicling historical events. The historical implausibility of the story is underscored by numerous factors. The absence of evidence in Egyptian records, the lack of archaeological traces in Sinai, despite purported 40 years of mass wandering, the anachronistic and inconsistent geographical and chronological references in the biblical text, and the evolution of Israelite society from indigenous Canaanite populations rather than from escaped Egyptian slaves. The narrative itself, composed and redacted over centuries, reflects the concerns of successive generations: consolidation of religious practice, codification of law, promotion of a collective identity, and affirmation of divine justice in the face of suffering. The Exodus functions not as a literal recounting of historical events, but as a moral and spiritual framework, conveying principles of justice, resilience, obedience, and hope that have been crucial for the survival and cohesion of communities throughout history. Its adaptability across cultures and eras, whether in Jewish exiles, Christian theological reinterpretations, or Islamic tradition, demonstrates its symbolic and pedagogical power. The story's endurance also illustrates the human need for myth to provide meaning where empirical evidence may be absent or ambiguous. Yet the insistence on its historicity in modern discourse has consequences. It risks conflating moral truth with factual truth, mythic narrative with empirical history, and spiritual authority with political entitlement. Understanding the Exodus as a myth, a constructed narrative, and a symbolic framework does not diminish its power. Rather, it allows for a more nuanced engagement with its lessons. The real significance of the story lies not in the literal crossing of the Red Sea, the miraculous provision of food, or the exact route through the wilderness, but in the enduring moral and spiritual principles it conveys: the imperative to resist oppression, the necessity of law and ethical conduct, the hope for deliverance, and the human capacity to endure trials with courage and faith. In this perspective, Moses becomes an archetype, a figure whose story embodies leadership, moral clarity, and the capacity to guide a people through adversity. Pharaoh becomes a symbol of systemic oppression and human hubris, and the wilderness becomes a metaphor for trials, moral testing, and spiritual growth. The Exodus thus remains one of the most compelling and influential narratives ever constructed, a story that shapes religious belief, ethical reasoning, cultural memory, and the imagination, not through historical fact, but through enduring symbolic truth. Its miracles, laws, and journeys resonate not because they happened exactly as described, but because they articulate human struggles and aspirations in a narrative form that continues to inspire, instruct, and unify across millennia. By acknowledging its mythic nature while preserving its moral and spiritual potency, we reconcile faith with reason, tradition with evidence, and hope with historical understanding, allowing the Exodus to remain a living, transformative narrative that illuminates the human quest for freedom, justice, and meaning in a complex and often challenging world.